Welcome back to the ash heap. Let's review where we are at this point in this kind of strange and dismal sort of story. The universe has been very unkind to Job, at least as personified in God and Satan, and that's through no fault of his own. Because given a certain natural model of what piety is, and given a certain very natural understanding of God's justice, if we're thinking in terms of a personal God, which of course in this tradition we are, the obvious explanation of Job's predicament is this: he has done something terrible to deserve this. However, we know that he hasn't. Even though none of us is perfect, Job is as close as it gets. He's so perfect that he's even, as we saw, offering sacrifices for the benefit of sins that his sons might have committed that nobody knows about, right? He's a really good guy. And the story is set up so that there's no question about this. What happened to Job was the result of a dice game between God and Satan. So the friends are working with what they've got, right? They've got a sense that piety is important, God is just, though God may well be mysterious, and they're arguing that there has to be something that Job did wrong, and all he's got to do is to repent. But we know that they're wrong. And Job knows that they're wrong. Job is so much smarter than they are. Job has already argued that the whole idea of cosmic justice, or if we want to personify it, the whole idea of divine justice makes no sense. Makes no sense. It is just a really bad extrapolation. We begin by a sense of what human justice is. I might deal justly with you, and we can determine that because an impartial third party, a judge who stands between us, can say, yes, that was a fair thing to do. Justice involves the perspective of a disinterested party. And justice is justice between people who, in some sense, are equal before the law. But Job sees that that's a really bad model for our relationships to God. Because God and we, no matter how you cut it, are not equal before the law. And moreover, there's no judge who could possibly mediate between us and God. To make matters worse, any reasonable person looking at what God has done would have to argue that this is already a case of terrible injustice. So, God has already left the domain of justice. We can't think about all of that. Philosophically, then, things have gone from bad to worse. We started at the beginning of this entire discussion with Job enduring suffering that he did not deserve. That is, maybe suffering that was undeserved in a particular case. Job himself, though, through his analysis and through his eloquent poetry, showed us that there's nothing particular about Job. We are all Job. All of us lead lives that are very short. All of us lead lives where we hope for some wonderful reward and typically don't get it. All of us lead lives where suffering happens, calamities happen that are no fault of our own. Chaldeans come into all of our houses. And so what Job has done, the book of Job that is to take the suffering of an individual and quickly universalize it. Now, in the book itself, we're now coming up on chapter 15, and things take a very interesting turn at this point in a thematic sense. Here's what I mean by that. The earlier chapters, discussion that we've had so far, has really involved the friends trying to convince Job that what's happening to him really is comprehensible, even if he doesn't understand it. Namely, it's punishment for some terrible thing that he's done, and it's punishment meted out by a God or a universe whose workings we understand. Good, just, wants repentance, all of that stuff. Job, of course, has been refuting all of that. And so, at 15, things change in an interesting way. And the friends turn the dialectic into a discussion of the incomprehensibility of the universe the incomprehensibility of God, and how we might make sense of the meaning of all of this in the context of not our ability to understand that we're being punished, but rather in terms of an incomprehensible universe. And I'd like to return to the text with you now for a moment. Should a wise man answer with windy knowledge? Should he argue with useless talk? That is, right now, what Eliphaz is doing is accusing Job of sophism, of just talking without understanding what he's doing. He now accuses Job directly. He says, should he argue with useless talk? Indeed, you do away with reverence and hinder meditation before God. For your guilt teaches your mouth, and you choose the language of the crafty. So let's pause on this for a moment. Eliphaz is charging Job with being just a little bit too clever for his own good, for engaging in all of this clever sophism, trying to demonstrate that what's happening to him is so unjust, trying to demonstrate that it's so incomprehensible. And so he's claiming that Job is pretending to be able to understand this at a level that he doesn't really indeed understand. And so he concludes, your own mouth condemns you and not I, and your own lips testify against you. So what Eliphaz is doing is saying, everything that you're saying right now actually is the problem. All of your spinning out these theories, claiming to understand what's going on, claiming even to understand that it's incomprehensible, that's the problem in the first place. That's what you're being punished for. Then he says to Job, again, kind of turning what Job said earlier when Job asked whether his friends were in fact God's attorneys. Eliphaz asks, do you, that is, do you, Job, hear the secret counsel of God and limit the wisdom to yourself? What do you know that we do not know? What do you understand that we do not? So Eliphaz here is charging Job with almost what Job charged his friends with earlier, trying to channel God and thinking that he's got more understanding than he does. That's why I say there's a kind of shift at 15, where now the discussion begins to take for granted incomprehensibility, whereas before it took for granted that everything made some kind of weird sense. So Eliphaz is saying, you know, Job, your problem is you think too much. You think you can understand this. You believe that you, Job, are so much smarter than we are, that whereas we don't know anything at all, you can penetrate the mystery of the universe. And then he continues, and he kind of blows it a little bit, because he says, you know what, Job, I've actually lived a long time. I've seen a lot. I've seen that God is just. You know, you look at wicked people, and they get punished, and good people don't. So he goes through and tells this story about the justice of God, which is unfortunate. Job comes back to him, though. I've heard many such things. Hey, I've heard that the wicked get punished too, you know. He continues, sorry comforters are you all. Is there no limit to windy words, or what plagues you that you answer? I too could speak like you if I were in your place. I could compose words against you and shake my head at you. But Job's saying, you know what? What you're doing is all too easy. It's really easy for you, who aren't suffering like I am, to say this stuff. You're not going through all of this. You weren't as good as I was. The Chaldeans didn't come and kill all of your camels. Your children didn't die. You don't have any understanding of what I'm going through. I have been completely ruined. I have been completely shamed. My life has been laid waste with no fault at all on my part. That's the problem. Your job now is to console me. Your job isn't to make up reasons why this might have happened. Bildad now returns to the attack. How long will you hunt for words? That is, Job, won't you stop arguing? Show understanding, and then we can talk. Be reasonable. Why are we regarded as beasts, as stupid in your eyes? That is, please take us seriously. O you who tear yourself in your anger, for your sake is the earth to be abandoned, or the rock to be moved from its place? That's an interesting line, actually. Bildad is asking, what is so special about you, Job? You're claiming you're the only person who suffers like this? You yourself have said that suffering is general. What's the big complaint? Take us seriously, recognize that if suffering is general and God is good, there's got to be some reason. So then Bildad builds this up with a kind of litany of how many times God has punished the wicked, right? That really, indeed, there's got to be some justice. So what Bildad is arguing is that Job's wickedness now, the wickedness that we really should care about, isn't just whatever sin he originally committed for which he was initially punished. I mean, Bildad takes seriously the idea that there had to have been such a sin, but he's saying, forget about that now. Things are continuing, and things are getting worse. The problem for Job now, according to Bildad, is that he refuses to accept the obvious explanation for that. And the real blasphemy, the blasphemy that's so serious that we have to take seriously now, is that Job thinks he can understand all of this and that he knows that God is unjust. That is, we're really focusing now on the limitations of human knowledge and human understanding. And Bildad is arguing that the real blasphemy is to think that you understand. Now, of course, notice the irony, because, of course, just a few verses ago, just a few chapters ago, this was the very guy who was arguing, I understand all of this, God is just, you screwed up. Now he's saying the real blasphemy is to think that you understand anything at all. But still, there's got to be some justice there. There's got to be justice because God has to be just in some sense. Job dismisses this pretty quickly. He says, look, this situation that I'm in is so bad. Such horrible things have happened to me, and it's so undeserved. I was so good. No reasonable person could possibly see it as just. Finally, at this point, we're now reaching chapters 20 and 21. Zophar does something that you would hope a friend does. He actually attempts some consolation. What does he say? Well, he tells Job, don't worry, Job. Everything comes out right in the end. This has got to be temporary. It's a passing thing. Nobody has boils for the rest of their lives. Sure, I, like you, have seen that Bildad is kind of wrong. Wicked people do sometimes triumph. That's right. But don't think that that's unjust, because the wicked people triumph only for a very short time. Eventually, good wins out in the end. Every story has got a happy, just ending. The world really is one great morality play. And I know that things are bad for you right now, but don't worry, it's going to be okay. God wouldn't let this go on forever. Job, again, will have absolutely none of this. Job does not want to hear that life is a fairy tale. He just says, hey, this just isn't true. You and I have lived a long time. We have seen too much injustice in the world to believe that. It's not true that good triumphs over evil all the time. Sometimes the wicked do just fine. Sometimes good people suffer absolutely terribly. You're not going to get away with an easy consolation like that. I guess I think this is an important moment in the text, and it's a moment in the text that forces us to really notice that the book of Job is about reality. It's about the real world, even though it's set on this kind of metaphorical ash heap that we know that we don't actually inhabit. But the point is that we do inhabit a very similar ash heap, the ash heap of reality, in which sometimes evil prospers, sometimes justice fails. And the book of Job is trying not to convince us that everything will come out right in the end, but rather that if we're going to lead meaningful lives and find meaning in our lives, we have to find meaning in a world that is in fact unjust and imperfect in exactly these ways. Bildad has a great idea for doing this. Bildad argues that in fact, the reason that this is so is that we are such tiny, worthless, insignificant specks in the universe. And God is so great, so majestic, so transcendent, that in fact, justice is all around us because even though really terrible things happen, we deserve it. We deserve whatever God does to us. In his own words at chapter 25, verse 6, we are maggots and worms. Now, that's an interesting idea. Let's consider the maggot and worm hypothesis more deeply. Because what this hypothesis is an attempt to salvage some idea that a realistic view of the world that sees it as unjust, a world in which terrible things happen even to good people, a world in which evil sometimes triumphs over good, a world in which even piety isn't rewarded, a world in which we often don't even understand why these bad things are happening to us, or for that matter, why good things happen to us, is exactly the just, reasonable world for God to have created. Why is it just and reasonable? Because we're worms and maggots. And worms and maggots just plain don't deserve very much. So God's given us exactly what we deserve, a totally trashy universe. See, there's justice after all. Well, it might make a weird kind of sense of things, but Job points out that this view is the real blasphemy, that this is the deepest blasphemy that you could possibly imagine. And what's more, that this would be a useless attempt to solve the problems that we've got. Because if we're taking for granted the idea that God is just and powerful and good, right, and that he gets to punish us because we deserve this, then to say in the same breath that we are maggots who deserve absolutely terrible lives would be to say that God justly and benevolently created a bunch of maggots to torture them. And that would make a hash out of God. But what's more, it would make our lives totally meaningless. The whole problem that the book of Job sets out to solve is how can we make meaning of our lives in the context of this world of injustice and suffering. To say that the way that you make sense of it is to think of yourself as a worm or a maggot is just to say, give up on the project of finding meaning in life. There is no meaning in your life. You're a worm or a maggot. That provides absolutely no comfort at all. Moreover, what does it say about our relationship to God, which is the other thing that's at issue here, right? Part of what's at issue in the book of Job is, what is my relationship to the divinity? If my relationship to the divinity is roughly like this, he thinks I'm absolute trash and crushes me under his heel or spreads insecticide on his garden to get rid of me, then you know what? He's not somebody with whom I would really like to have a relationship in the first place. And in fact, I could kind of blame him for getting the whole thing going. It seems to be a colossal error. So this becomes a kind of blasphemy because it's a weird kind of theodicy. It's a weird kind of explanation of evil in the world that really makes God look pretty bad and makes our lives look totally meaningless in the first place. At this point, a new character enters. The new character is Elihu, who we're told is a kind of younger person in this whole affair. And again, as a kind of footnote, biblical scholars disagree about Elihu. Some people think that he's a later interpolation into the text. Some people think that he was there all along. I don't actually know what the answer to that is, and scholarship is unsettled about that. But anyway, he enters as yet another interlocutor. Elihu, who's fairly sharp but also fairly rash, agrees that Bildad, Eliphaz, and Zophar have utterly failed to answer Job. He agrees Job has been able to refute every suggestion they've made. But, he points out, there still is a problem, and it's a problem that they missed. The problem is that Job, in all of his lamentations, in all of his refutations, in all of his explanations, claims to have a case against God. He claims to be charging God with treating him badly. And to have a case against God is to commit two sins, the sin of pride, to think that you can bring a case against God, and rebellion, to rebel against he who is supposed to be your monarch. And so Elihu urges that in fact, if Job would only pay attention, God is trying to tell him something through all of this. So let me read to you one of the passages from Elihu. And if they are bound in their fetters, That is, if somebody's having troubles. Then he declares to them their work and their transgressions, and he opens their ear to instruction and commands that they return from evil. So Elihu's idea is a very simple one. He says, God's actually trying to tell you something. Why don't you shut up and listen? Instead of offering all of these arguments, just be quiet. If you pay attention to what God is doing, you're going to come to understand something. So, Job points out that this is even worse because Job doesn't understand, right? There's no obvious message in all of this. What's the message behind killing all of somebody's kids, destroying all of their wealth and livestock, afflicting them with boils, and leaving them on an ash heap with 3 lousy friends? I mean, give me a break. How are you supposed to interpret that? Why doesn't God use skywriting if he wants to tell him something? And if all of this really is meaningless, then the real blasphemy, Job says, is Elihu's. You're trying to say God's trying to tell me something, but then he turns out to be meaningless and incoherent. So you're saying he's kind of stupid. But there is an interesting deep point. There's an interesting deep point being made here that Elihu and Job are working at together. And this is one of the reasons that Elihu stands out as slightly different from the 3 so-called friends. That is, if we look at the world, and this is kind of Elihu's point, or if we look at a deity, and we see that things in the world look meaningless or unfair, and that we can't understand what's going on, that they're incomprehensible to us, that they seem unfair to us, we should recognize that we're looking at them from a particular individual perspective. There are 2 possibilities here. It may well be that things are meaningless and we're smart enough to see that they're meaningless. It might be that things are unfair and we're smart enough to see that they're unfair. But it might also be that there's another possibility, that things actually are meaningful, that there is a pattern to things, that there is a message in the course of events, and we're too stupid to see it, that our perspective is too narrow, our minds are too limited, our egoism is too great, and that we don't actually understand the larger pattern. And so Elihu's point is that Job may be blaming God or blaming the universe for his own inability to comprehend all of this. And you can imagine this. If I assign my students a textbook or a difficult philosophical text, and they come in and say, this is complete nonsense, we can't understand it. By the way, this happens. The phrase, this is complete nonsense, we can't understand it, is an interesting one. They're inferring from their own inability to understand the text that the text is meaningless, instead of inferring that they may not yet be smart enough to understand the text that's been placed in front of them. So this is a deep point. Elihu has made the first really deep point against Job. The point is so deep, so profound, that Job doesn't respond. That's not to say that there's no response. This is the point, the climax, the drum roll, where God responds. And God responds in a weird and powerful and oblique way. He agrees that none of what has been said makes any sense. Neither Eliphaz, nor Zophar, nor Bildad, nor Elihu, nor even Job is actually making any sense of this at all. God says everybody's managing to screw it up. But he really challenges the 3 friends in Elihu. And in doing that, he's also really challenging us. Because again, something that I've been saying all along as I've been talking about Job is that Job is all of us. But we're not just Job. We don't get just one role in this little drama. Elihu, Zophar, Bildad, Eliphaz, they're us too. Each of us can recognize ourselves as somebody who has got a certain amount of faith that everything comes out right, a certain amount of faith that our universe is just, a certain amount of faith that the cheaters never prosper, a certain amount of faith that if we're really good and try hard, everything's going to be okay. and a certain amount of faith that really, if we think hard enough, the universe is comprehensible, and that the meaning in our life comes from aligning ourselves from a comprehensible universe. For that reason, don't read this book and smugly identify yourself with the hero, but also worry about these other folks. So God's talking to us in his voice here when he says, "Who are you to question me?" So God asks this question, right? He says, "I'm so far beyond you in any accomplishment, in any power, in any knowledge. I know so much more than you. I'm so much greater than you. You have absolutely no standing with respect to me. You've got nothing to say about what I'm doing, why I'm doing it, whether it's okay. Forget about it." Now, this is pretty weird, right? I mean, God's just told us he's totally incomprehensible and we shouldn't even try. But in doing this, God is echoing and reconciling 2 points that were made earlier in the text. The first is Job's point, that there's no judge between man and God. The whole idea of justice is absolutely nonsense when we talk about the relationship between human beings and the divinity, or human beings and the universe. The second point, though, is the charge that Elihu just made, and that is that Job has no business challenging God at all, because Job has, on the one hand, said there's no justice here, and on the other hand, he's developed this challenge. He's challenged God with injustice, with treating him badly. But God's point goes a bit deeper. You would expect that because God's, in the Bible, a pretty deep guy. God's saying he isn't just. Justice makes absolutely no sense here. There's no point in beginning to talk about justice. Moreover, there doesn't have to be any hidden purpose behind what God does. God doesn't owe us a justification, doesn't owe us a purpose, doesn't owe us caring about us at all. Indeed, God is pointing out, we don't deserve the suffering that we endure. We don't necessarily deserve it anyway. And that's because the universe isn't organized around us. I actually think that this is the deepest message of the book of Job, that all of the friends, and indeed Job at the beginning, take for granted the idea that the universe is organized around us to reward our good deeds, to punish our bad deeds, to be comprehensible to us, to be a place there where we can lead our meaningful lives and be happy. The point at the end is that is the most terrible hubris, the most terrible pride of all, to think that somehow it's all about me, and that if I only try hard enough, I can understand exactly how and why it's all about me. And that God is up there thinking, gee, what should I do for me right now? God doesn't care. God's got other things to worry about. The universe has got its own worries, and they're not our worries. The idea here is that we can't necessarily make sense of our lives. We can't necessarily make sense of God. And so then the book ends, right? Job concedes everything is beyond his comprehension. He can't understand any of this. God scolds the friends for trying to speak for him. That is, God scolds the friends for trying to make the world comprehensible, for trying to make God's incomprehensibility comprehensible. Then the weird part happens, right? God makes everything okay. He gives Job a new family, new sons, new daughters, new wife, gives Job new camels, new donkeys, new fields. It gives him a long, healthy life. Everything is happy in the end. This last part really is odd. As I said at the beginning, the end and the beginning of the text might have been grafted on later. They might just reflect a dramatic cultural difference. It might just be one more mystery that the text is asking us to contemplate. How could this make any sense? But let us ask the question, what does the book of Job then say about the meaning of life? It's a disturbing vision. The book provides us with this vision of a vast universe, a vast world, perhaps personified in a deity, in which we are very small players. We might think, either reflectively or instinctively, that the universe is organized to reward and to punish us. But in fact, the book of Job reminds us we're not all that important. We really aren't all that important. Suffering is rampant in the world. Our lives are indeed, as Job says, ephemeral. The divine might be omnipresent, that is, there might be a divinity to the world, as indeed the Gita suggests. But whatever that divinity is, it's not about justice. It's not about us. The fundamental nature of the universe and our lives might well be beyond our understanding. Meaning in the book of Job is found not in wealth or in social relations as it is for Aristotle, but rather in a relationship to a very mysterious divine. It's not a view that life is meaningless, but it is a view that we might need to live our lives without knowing that meaning, in complete ignorance of that meaning. It's very different from the Gita in that sense, which might seem to be more foreign to us, because the Gita promises us knowledge of the divine. It's very different from Aristotle, because Aristotle's got no place for this unknowable transcendent. This is a much more pessimistic view, but still it's a view that speaks directly to us, because we do live in a world that in many senses is deeply incomprehensible. The Gita looks to a kind of union with the cosmos. Aristotle advises us to lead a kind of rational, moderate life in the temporal world. Each of those views is one in which happiness and a meaningful life is something we can achieve through our own choices. The book of Job, though, sees us as living at the mercy of an incomprehensible world, sees us as relatively powerless. We're going to see each of these kinds of themes recurring through the course. These three texts, the Bhagavad Gita, the Nicomachean Ethics, and the book of Job, will be our touchstones. Join me for our next lecture.